Hey everybody, this is Everyday Commentary, and this is a Sweet Stuff Saturday, recorded on a Saturday. So, before we get started and talk about the knives that are there, I just want to talk a little bit about what I was carrying today. So these are the two items I'm going to carry today. This is the Spyderco Brewer, and it has a lynch clip. I put the lynch clip on almost, probably within a week of getting the knife, because the original clip came up to like here and was just terrible. But this is one of my favorite knives. I wish they would make this in a sprint. I'd love to see this with some better steel. It's S30V, which isn't bad, but I'd really like to see it with a wire clip. This knife with a wire clip would be wire clip and better steel would be one of the best Spydercos out there. The shape in the hand is just unbeatable. The blade shape is nice. The knife's size is really great. So just a really good overall knife, something I use on a pretty regular basis. As you can see, it's got some scratches and some use marks, but nothing too bad. The flashlight I'm carrying today is the Zebralight SC5C2 limited edition. They don't make this light anymore. They do make a light very similar to it. I think that this light is a little bit better. I like the clip and the body shape a little bit better than the replacement, but they're basically equivalent. I mean, pretty much all of the Zebra lights are the same. This light is a really great forward clicky. You know, I like the tail cap clickies better, because most of the time the clickies that are up here on the side, they tend to get activated on accident. This one, because of the way it's recessed and the shape of the recess, is very hard. But it's a great light. It's a perfect size light in hand. It's not too small. You can still control it. And it gives you a little bit of throw because it's got a real reflector as opposed to a TIR reflector. Overall, this is a pretty straightforward, simple, easy to carry setup. If this light dies, it's dual fuel, so you can take out the battery and replace the battery and keep going with an alkaline. It reduces the output, but the light will still keep going. So these two knives came in this week. They came in on the same day. I was not expecting them to come in on the same day. One of them is a review sample sent to me by the company, and it's this one, the Tesseract Tactical NF1. And then this is the first Reate budget for Reate knife. I think it's the PLX, something like that. And it is, as you can see, it's a chunky boy. Both of these knives are pretty chunky. Who's chunkier? This is a little chunkier. But let's talk a little bit about both knives. So, this knife, I think it's the PLX, the Reate PLX, is designed to be their first budget knife. And what they've done is they have decided to go with a non-powder steel. This might be the first non-powder steel in a Reate. In this case, Nitro V, which in my opinion is one of the two best non-powder steels, the other being 14C28N. And this is a new lock design. It is, I don't know the functionality. I haven't taken it apart, and I don't plan on taking it apart. But it's a pivot lock. So there are a couple of systems out there that are pivot locks. The original, to my knowledge, is one made by Paul Pullman. The Pullman lock, it was produced by Gerber, and then Gerber could not make it work because it was just too complicated to make it profitably. So they stopped producing a Pullman lock knife. Then Lone Wolf, I believe Lone Wolf purchased the rights, exclusive rights to use the Pullman lock, and they had theirs running for a while. Their company got bought out by Benchmade, and then Benchmade took over making the Pullman lock knives. And unfortunately, the Pullman lock knives were just too complicated to make on a scale that would make them profitable. They were expensive, they were tedious, they were fiddly, they were hard to put together. But the thing that was really interesting was, despite all of that complexity, they were a really great design. On a Pullman lock, you would deploy, the knife would have no thumb stud. You could have the knife completely submerged in the handle, and you would pinch the lock, you'd pinch the pivot on each side, and then you could rotate the blade out. Once you got it to the place where it was, you just let go, and there was a little spring inside, and it would lock the blade in place. To close the knife, you do the exact opposite action. This is not a Pullman lock. This works differently, but it does have the benefit of being pretty intuitive as well. You know, the button as the pivot means you know what you're supposed to do. You could hand this knife to somebody who's not a knife person and they're going to figure it out because these pivot locks are so intuitive. The other knife that has a pivot lock is the deadbolt lock from CRKT, which I have found to be very, very useful. Not only is it a nice, strong lock, but it is also, again, very intuitive. It does not seem to have any of the machining complexity of the Pullman lock. So the question is, how does this pivot lock on this knife fare compared to the Pullman and compared to the deadbolt lock? So when I originally got this knife, the button was over, there's like a ridge here. There's a ridge in the G10. And the button actually was floating slightly above the ridge. I didn't know that it wasn't supposed to be like that. And I used the knife for a couple of days, and the knife button started to come apart. And the secondary lock would no longer work. It was very difficult to disengage. The button had kind of, you know, it sits down in like a setup like this, but it tilted off axis, so when I would push it to close, it would lock, and the knife would actually lock open, which is, locking open and locking closed are both bad. Locking open for a folder is really bad, because not only is the knife now no longer a folder and not functional, but it's not as strong as a fixed blade. So once I figured out that the knife had come from the factory way too loose, I tightened down the pivot and locked it in place. And I've had it I got this on Monday, and this is Saturday. I tightened the pivot down on Wednesday, and it's been pretty good ever since. There's no blade play. There's no up and down blade play. The lock works again, and the secondary lock works again, and it's very easy to disengage the knife. One of the things that you'll notice is that because of all of the internal mechanisms that are housed inside this pivot, the knife is just really thick. And Reate did try to lighten it by putting in these lightning holes and really skeletonizing the liner. You can see that not only are there lightning holes, but then there's a set of holes here, and there's a set of holes near the spine of the knife as well. So there's actually 3 rows of holes on each side of the knife, just doing everything they can to make this knife lighter, because as it is still quite the brick. I don't know how to change. I don't know how they would improve the design. I mean, one thing that I would do is I would definitely not use a backspacer. I'd just go with standoffs, but you know, what are you going to do? But this is a really, really interesting knife. The question I still haven't answered in my brain is whether or not it's worth all of this hassle to do this lock. Like this knife, if it was a liner lock, that wouldn't be too terrible. The blade shape is pretty standard, as you can see. It's a drop point with a false swedge. There's a nice little forward finger choil there. The blade finish is, of course, nicely done. And like with all Reate stuff, it's very, very clean. One thing that's interesting is that this is like really, really thick blade stock. So I'm just not sure that it has to be this bulky. Like if they had like TRM Neutron 2 thin blade stock, the knife would be smaller. I mean, it would be thinner. It wouldn't be tiny, but it would be at least a little better. But Reate just does not make thin, slicey blades, which is one of the reasons why I'm not as enamored with Reate as everybody else is. It's just like, well, you don't need to do this. You made your knife worse. But overall, I think the knife is very well made. I think this button lock is really very fiddly. I'm not sure of the benefits, but the knife's shape is pretty standard and traditional. The choil is good. Deployment isn't bad. It's, you know, pretty fast. It's not snappy or anything, but, you know, it opens and closes with ease, as you can see. The clip is good. I mean, this is, other than the lock, this is a pretty basic knife. And when you reduce a knife down to its simplest forms and you do those forms, you make those forms really well, you got a good knife. I'm just not sure why it needs to be so thick in the blade and whether or not the lock is worth it. So those are 2 things we'll think about when we are carrying this knife and preparing for review. So that was, I believe it's the Reate PLX. I think it's the pivot lock something, PLX, whatever. This knife is from a new company, and this company is called Tesseract Tactical. And there's their logo, and then you can see there's a very little billboarding. There's the logo right there. There's the blade steel stamp, and then the model number, and then there's the logo one more time on the pocket clip. This is a pretty basic knife. This is the NF1. This knife retails for like 115 bucks. This knife retails for 199 bucks. That is a very high price point for this steel. S35 steel is not a bad steel, but for $200, you could get a Hogue Deca with Magna Cut and then like Subway for 4 days. So that's a lot of money for a knife that runs S35VN. But there's something here that I think is worth pointing out. This knife is impeccably designed and made. Everything about this knife is clean, is really, really consistent. The machining is excellent. This is a simple knife, but everything is done very, very well. Look at the pivot here. I mean, I can disengage the knife and then have this be drop shut. Now, a lot of knives that are drop shut either have loose pivots or they have some kind of gimmick in the pivot where it's like, you know, the bearings past this certain point and then there's basically no resistance. But this knife is just capable of doing drop shut stuff because it is really a very well made knife. It is executed exceptionally well. And this is their first offering. So let's talk a little bit about some of the cool stuff on the knife. So you've seen me while I'm playing around with it. You can deploy it very easily with the Spidey flick. You can also deploy it via the flipper quite well. I like the blade shape. It's got, it's a worny kind of blade, but it's still got real belly. Like that a lot. But the things that are sort of stand out, I like liners. I mean, like, I know it's kind of dorky and it just adds a little bit of aesthetic flair, but I do like liners, and they did a great job with these orange liners. So this is a black G10, very nicely textured with great orange liners. The liners do add a little thickness, but they also add this pop of color that helps accentuate the knife. And it is, again, this subtle sign that this is a very well-made knife. The liners, of course, are not proud in any way. They're completely flush. And then I also really like this pocket clip. The pocket clip has 2 screws, one here and one here. But if you notice on the other side, there's a screw. So what you do is you just take this off and then you can rotate it and it will clip down, and then you push this screw through that hole. It's a really ingenious setup to make this knife ambidextrous, or make the clip ambidextrous. It's still a liner lock, so it's gonna want to close with one hand, the right hand. But this is a very, very nice, good-looking clip, and the switch from one side to the other is quite clever. I do want to point out, just like I did with the other knife, this backspacer here is really quite bulky and kind of unnecessary, but it does look good. It's chamfered, so it's not like gonna have sharp corners or anything. But the logo there is pretty cool, and it is something that allows it gives a little more beef to the lanyard hole. I don't think you ever need it. Like, there's no way you're gonna break through this, even without this extra load or extra weight from the backspacer. A couple other nice touches. If you notice here, they have a little ramp for your finger. Your finger will almost always hit right beyond this. So there's definitely enough space to get in and hit the flipper. But there's also the same thing in the front, little cutouts here. Oftentimes, I think of liner locks as being push liner locks or wedge liner locks. A push liner lock is one where it's exposed. Here you can see it's not exposed from the side. The cutouts are symmetrical on both sides. So it's a wedge. You just push your thumb in and wedge it over. By having these cutouts, though, it is really, really easy. I prefer the push as opposed to the wedge style liner locks. But if you're going to do a wedge style liner lock, having these cutouts here really does a great job. You can see that they've also thought about the lock bar relief, and they've removed the liner here so that the lock bar has the ability to flex out of the way. Every single detail here was just really, really, really well done. And this is one of the best flippers I've ever seen. I mean, I'm putting hardly any pressure on this at all. I have not been able to get, there we go. Oh, I've not been able to get this to fail to fire. The action on this knife really does remind me of the action on some of the best production knives out there. I've had Shirogorovs, and this reminds me a lot of the action you find on a Shirogorov. I like this little detail here around the thumb cutout. It just gives the knife a little bit more visual pizzazz. The jimping is well cut. And the handle, while being big and meaty, something I'm not a huge fan of, does fit well in the hand. You are put right up to where the blade is. I mean, the distance between your finger and the blade is pretty close. You got a lot of control. That's about as good as you're going to find without having a choil. Overall, I think as a first offering, this is a very impressive knife. They're going for the absolute middle of the enthusiast market. Not too big, not too small, not too thin, not too fat. Really emphasizing the fit and finish and the deployment action. This is going to be an interesting knife to review. In a lot of ways, this knife reminds me of the CRKT Squid 2. Just a very simple design, executed incredibly well with a little bit of bulk. If you want to know something really weird, this knife has a significantly thinner blade than the Reate. I just don't get Reate's obsession with slabby knives. Like, get rid of those big, thick blades. No one likes them. You don't need them. But this knife has despite having a bulky appearance, it has a relatively thin knife, which means this thing cuts really, really well. I've carried this knife for a couple days this week, and it was just a laser in the pocket. So, Tesseract knives, this is a real deal kind of thing. This is a good knife. This is not some, some design they bought off the shelf from one of the nameless OEMs and slapped their logo on it. This is a thoughtful design with lots of nice touches. Low degree of difficulty, but really, really high execution. So, there you go. That was a little bit longer than I anticipated, but enjoy the video.